In our last lesson, I showed you the three main parts of the wheat berry using an egg for a model. And I explained that the egg white was a symbol for the endosperm, or the part of the wheat that's extracted to make white flour. Now, I also mentioned that in the endosperm there were some specific proteins that were unique to wheat and wheat-related grains that are very important to us in our bread making. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit more today, using the egg white once again to represent white flour, as I put it into my mixer and show you how once those proteins are activated, they actually cause the structure of the bread to be the way that it is. This will also help to explain why you may have had success with white bread in the past, but when you try to use the same recipe or techniques with your whole grain bread, it didn't work out as well. I'm going to start by just adding this egg white to the mixer, and as you know, of course, that's really going to make meringue, but we're going to pretend that it's making white bread. Well, after I scraped the bowl clean of all of the meringue that I made, this is what it looks like. And I hope that it reminds you of fluffy white bread that you would buy at the store, because it's light and soft and airy, just like white flour is when you mix it into bread. And now what would have happened if during the time that this was mixing and making into meringue, I had gotten any part of the yolk into there? Well, of course, it wouldn't have fluffed up the same way. It wouldn't have made meringue like it did. And the same is true when you start with 100% whole grain flour. When you have the germ and the bran added in to the rest of the flour, then it weighs it down and it doesn't enable it to puff up quite as much, quite as easily as it would have if that were not present. So the reason for this explanation is to show you that there is a specific protein in here that forms, that is activated. And that protein is called gluten. That's the protein that is formed as a result of the mixing and the kneading that you do and the ingredients that you put into the bread. And the gluten is what gives the structure to the bread. The yeast helps it to rise, and the gluten helps it to hold the rise. And so that's why it's very important to start with a grain flour that has enough gluten in it and that it's activated or kneaded correctly. So we're going to keep this in mind as we talk about the ingredients for bread making, the types of grain that you're going to need to purchase and keep on hand, or if you're not grinding your own flour yet, the type of flour that you're going to buy to use in your bread making. Throughout the last several years that I've been teaching bread class, something that I hear all the time from people is how much they are afraid of using yeast. They've told me that yeast makes them nervous, they don't like yeast, they think yeast doesn't like them. They can't understand why anytime they try a recipe that calls for yeast, that it seems like it's always doomed for failure. So I'm here to debunk the myth that whenever you have a problem with your bread making, that it's always the fault of yeast. Sometimes it might be, but more often than likely it's not. The fact is that yeast works in partnership with gluten. Yeast and gluten are very good friends, and they both need to be present for a successful loaf of bread. Now, you've just seen how gluten has to be activated. Well, yeast has to be activated too, and the thing that they share in common is that they're both activated in part by water. Now, the gluten doesn't care how the temperature of the water is. The yeast is a little more sensitive. The one thing to keep in mind with yeast is that it can be killed by too hot of water. It likes warm water to help it wake up and start growing, but it doesn't want to get too hot, and the number to keep in mind is 140. At 140 degrees, yeast will die. So if you've ever added water to your bread that was too hot, you may have killed your yeast. Now, outside of that, if as long as your yeast was good and as long as you didn't use water that was too hot, then yeast probably was not the cause of your bread failure or your bread disappointment. Both yeast and gluten need a second element to complete the activation. For gluten, it's the kneading, it's the agitation, the mixing around. For yeast, it's food. Yeast needs to be fed with some type of sugar. Now, we're actually going to go into more detail on those things a little bit later, but for now, understand that both of these ingredients have to be activated in your bread. Now, let me show you why that's so important to understand. If you have had a successful activation of yeast in your bread recipe before, but you didn't have successful activation of the gluten, then here is something that might have happened. Now, I have a little model to show you, and something that you're going to learn about me throughout this class is that I love to use hands-on experiments and models and analogies to really drive home the points that you need to understand in order to make your bread as good as it can be. So I have a balloon here, and this balloon represents a loaf of bread, but more specifically, it represents the gluten in the loaf of bread. And then inside here, I have some little pieces of confetti, which represents the yeast. So have you ever tried to blow up a balloon that was just too tight? You just blew and blew and you couldn't get it to budge. Well, you needed to stretch it and work it and play with it a little bit, and then you're able to blow it up. So first of all, you need to make sure that your dough is nice and soft and pliable. If it's very stiff and it's very hard, then the yeast doesn't have any room to expand inside it. It's just not able to push hard enough and get it to open up to be able to rise like it needs to. Now let's say that you got your dough worked into a soft state, but maybe you just didn't keep kneading it long enough. So let me show you what might have happened in that case. Okay, can you see those little yeast bubbles dancing around? As soon as the yeast gets activated, it starts to bubble up and foam and rise. All of those little air bubbles are pushing up and out on the loaf of bread. Now, if you've ever had your bread get to this point where it has risen nice and round and you thought, yay, I'm gonna have a great loaf of bread, and then you put it into the oven and later you took it out and it came out a lot smaller than when you put it in. It sunk and became a dense, dry brick. Well, then what may have happened is that you did not have the gluten worked enough to the point that it could hold the rise of the bread. Remember I said that the yeast creates the rise, the gluten holds the rise. The gluten you can think of as a skeleton, and we need a skeleton to support our bodies, and you need gluten strands, gluten fibers, to hold up the bread. As soon as the internal temperature of the bread reaches 140 degrees, remember, yeast dies. When the yeast dies, it's no longer pushing up and out on the dough in the form of those little yeast bubbles. Those little yeast bubbles start to dissipate and start to deflate, and if the gluten network is there and it's in place, it will take over where the yeast leaves off. Those gluten fibers will solidify and they will harden during baking, and it will hold your bread up at the level that it has risen to initially. So now that you know a little bit more about how yeast and gluten work together and are dependent on each other, I hope you won't have any more fears or worries when it comes to yeast. In the next several lessons, we're going to go into more detail about some other things that will help you to make the best loaf of bread possible.